Well, there have been different reactions regarding the sale of South African Express Airway to a local consortium called Fly-SAX last week, or Fly-SAX. Now, while some expressed concern over the sum of 50 million rand for which the airline was sold, others voiced uneasiness over the privatisation of the airline. According to the liquidators, SA Express's assets were valued at over 100 million rand, but the preferred bidder, Fly-SAX, offered half of that. In addition, the entity apparently owes its creditors close to R1 billion, and it owes the South African Revenue Service 150 million and about 183 million rand to its workers. Now, last year, SA Express was placed under provisional liquidation, inviting anyone who wanted to oppose the final order to do so by June 2020. The National Union of Mineworkers and the SA Cabin Crew Association approached the High Court in Pretoria, and an extension was granted. The online public auction of the airline closed in November last year. With us, aviation analyst Des Latham will be discussing this and, of course, the SAA Labour Court outcome as well. Des, good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Leanne.
So what is your view on this whole sale of SA Express at 50 million rand? I mean, and its privatisation. I mean, talk to us about this.
Well, I mean, the big issue there, if you read between the lines, they managed to gain about 24 million out of the sale of some of the old aircraft parts, including auxiliary motors and so on, in November, that auction you were talking about. So that's they were expecting double that, as you're saying. But of course, airlines around the world are not flying. So expectations were dashed by the fact that the business as a whole is suffering. But the second big thing where there's, you have to mention this, is that Fly-SAX is a Kenyan operation. It's linked to Kenya. And what they were really interested in was the license, in other words, to operate, and the locations. They're not interested in the staff or the management or our operations per se. They really wanted to get their hands on the the rights to land and airports rights and so on. So that's the big thing here. And because those lapsed in June last year or July last year for SA Express, it's not really clear, in terms of the South African Civil Aviation Authority, if they still have the rights to those routes.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that, the Department of Public Enterprises says it can't afford to part with more money and had to sell the airline. But how much value have SA Express or even SAA actually brought as a public asset?
Well, none in the last 10 years, because they've been running at a loss. So, I mean, the real value is job creation and then sustainability in terms of business practice, and there's been no sustainability in both. So you have to say, for the taxpayer, we've been funding a loss-leading operation for political reasons largely, and that is that the ANC would like to have an airline that they can boast about, I guess, and put their MPs onto and fly them to China, etc., etc. But, with that aside, you've got to look at the value in terms of science aviation's strategy. And I've always said that having some airline linked to your state is a positive thing if you can take your hands off running it. And the ideal example of this was, of course, Ethiopian Airlines, which is 100% government-owned, but the government does not run it. It's hands-off. In other words, it's hired people who know how to run aviation. In SAA and SA Express, what happened is cadre deployment, like we've had in other state-owned entities. So you have a situation of managers managing managers. You have a top-heavy organization, and the unions have warned about it repeatedly. So as a whole, I'm afraid that we've dug ourselves into a large hole there when it comes to both of these operations. And in terms of a crisis, which is the pandemic, this is where the reality really has hit us.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a real reality, because I mean, if you look at the amount of money that's been pumped into saving these airlines, as well as the whole liquidation process, and getting 50 million rand as a sale out of it. I mean, I'm not sure I understand it. And that's I think what's very, very difficult for South Africans to try and grasp, is the amount of money, taxpayers' money, that's been thrown at these airlines, and we walk away for just 50 million rand. Let's talk about that for a second.
Well, I've also said that. I mean, you look at SA, it's 5,000 workers and their dependents, so it's 30,000 people, but they're 58 million South Africans. And basically, 58 million South Africans have been subsidizing a few thousand workers, which is, of course, unconscionable. When you're facing existential crisis and unemployment that's close to 30%, it just makes no sense to us that for a few thousand workers and highly skilled pilots, that the rest of us are technically being held to ransom politically some kind of nationalist sentiment over this logic. And the second thing I must say is that SA Express, remember, started in 94. It's a baby of democracy, if you like, whereas South African Airways is a baby of apartheid. It started in the 30s, long ago. And you've got to then assess, what is the business model and how has the operation worked? I mean, in 2010, there were 800 pilots working at SAA. There are now 380. So much for transformation and job creation and empowering black pilots of the future. What actually happened was the management at SAA and at SA Express have eaten the money.
Yeah. So what happens, in terms of all of the money we spoke that is owed in the introduction? I mean, where I said that a total of 980 million rand was owed to creditors. It also owes South African Revenue Service 150 million rand and 83 million rand owed to workers. What happens there? Does the buyer take on that expense, or is that still an expense that we have to cover?
Well, good question. I mean, so that's one of the big things that we're looking at in terms of underwriting the debt on this. But a normal creditor process when it comes to business rescue, which is what this is that you have 3 months to kind of decide what to do with the company. The big thing that SA Express is facing is legal action regarding the directors and the executive. It looks like they took the 1.7 billion, and I'm speaking under correction here, but at the same time, the High Court is looking at allegations of corruption. If you, as a director of a company, take money knowing that the company is basically unable to function in the verge of bankruptcy, that has a major impact on you as a functioning business person in the country. And that's what's happened here. As SA Express management are now being asked to account for the fact that they took the money from the taxpayer, knowing that it's a lost lead. In other words, that it's not a sustainable business. If that's proven, this is possibility of jail time for individuals, let alone the fact that they're going to become like Dudumeni, the director, which is a delinquent now. She can no longer be a director of any or sit on a board. These individuals at SA Express face a significant moment in their lives where they took the money, and if it's proven that they know that it was not a viable operation after taking cash from the taxpayer, they're personally in big trouble.
Yeah, well, they certainly are. But I mean, let's talk to the workers, though. I mean, what rights do they have? Because they are owed this money, they've been promised this money. So where do they turn to? Where do they go from now?
Looking at the story, it's very much a South African story, isn't it? I mean, you've got the majority of the pilots are still white, for example. It has transformed largely over the last decade in particular. And that's one of the terrible ironies for me. But that's the first thing to say. And the majority of workers are black. So you have this situation that has developed in the discussion where NUMSA and others have received information from the legal team, particularly in this latest case, where they did not sign the liquidation agreement and the retrenchment notices. And now they're saying that they would like to accept some of the terms after the fact. And the Labour Court has ruled, well, you were not biased. Which was not biased against you. You just decided not to do this based on your strategy. So you can hardly then go back to the entity, Public Works, the ministry and so on, and say to them, you may not be part of this process of negotiation, which is what happened to the Labour Court, and that's why one of the reasons why the case was chucked out last week, for example, and say that, okay, as workers, we must have a right to question what management are doing. And this is what I'm afraid NUMSA and others have been doing at SAA. But now we're in a situation where NUMSA is going to lose members. If NUMSA loses members, it loses money. So NUMSA has got its own management portfolio. They have car allowances and house allowances and so on in these unions. So you can see it's a mess. And we got to this mess because of bad management principles in the aviation sector of state-owned entities. And it's as simple as that.
Des, very quickly, we're about to run into huge time problems. I've got to say goodbye soon. But let's quickly touch on SAA. NUMSA is up in arms and air chefs have not been paid since March last year. Help us understand the recent Labour Court outcome, which favoured SAA and the rescue practitioners.
Well, that's a legal technicality. So what they're saying is that the Labour Court said that the approach was mismanaged, basically, by the legal team. They were essentially saying that because they hadn't signed the agreement with SAA, by the way, 85% of the workers at SAA have signed the retrenchment agreement. So there's a tiny minority, if you look at it another way, saying that now that they believe their rights have been wronged, that they are owed the back pay and so on, even though they didn't agree to it by November last year. So the Labour Court, in a nutshell, is saying to them, well, you made a decision that you were not going to accept a retrenchment in terms of the business rescue process. So it's actually there's two phases here. One is the Companies Act, and one is the act that falls, the Labour Act that some of this debate falls under. But what the Labour Court basically said, this is a Companies Act decision. It's not a Labour Court decision. And how did you end up here, NUMSA, with your lawyers when they must have known that that's the fact? You need to go to the companies and peruse the Companies Act and understand the process, and it's called business rescue.
All right, leave it there, Des. Thanks so much. I mean, this aviation industry deserves a really long analysis because there's so much going on. But thanks so much for joining us. Des Latham, aviation analyst, talking to us about that recent sale of SA Express to a private company for 50 million rand and the plight of South African Airways as well. But we'll continue to follow up and report on that story.